Hey folks, welcome back to our channel. My name is Nigel and this is Offgrid Van Life, where we look at van conversions, lithium iron phosphate batteries, off-grid power, and basically everything that you need to be able to get on the road and find that adventure in your van and have an awesome electrical system to enable you to do whatever you need to do, whether that's making coffee, playing video games on a TV in your van somewhere epic, whatever it is that you want to do, we want to help you get there. So in this video I'm going to be talking about the topic of insulation, and it's something that I've had quite a few comments on YouTube here, just asking things like, what's our plan, can we talk about it, why are we making the decisions we are on this van, what's our approach with it. So I'm going to be covering that in this video. So this is a hot debated subject. It is debated so much back and forth, like what's the best source of insulation, should you have a vapor barrier, all of these different things. You can go backwards and forwards, and to be honest, there are sort of merits and pros and cons to every recommendation that somebody has, and there is definitely science to it, but to a large extent it just depends on what you're doing as well. If you're living in your van, then you obviously need to really take into consideration stuff like your moisture barrier, all that sort of stuff. If you're doing like day trips or weekend trips, or kind of maybe the odd longer trip here and there where you might be in the van for an extended period of time, then obviously you need to take into consideration those as well. But largely, broadly speaking, what happens with these vans is that obviously the outside, the shell, is generally quite cold, especially in winter, obviously. And as you heat the inside, that does different things to the moisture in the air. So when we breathe, obviously we're breathing out moisture through our breath. And what happens then is when that moisture comes into contact with the cold surface on the outside of the van, the shell, that's when it condenses back into liquid. And so if we were to run a heater just inside this shell here with no insulation, any moisture in here would go to the outside, and then it would condense on the walls and on the windows and stuff like that. And so that's really what the vapor barrier is trying to get around. So I'm going to be tackling it in a few ways in this van, and I'll talk you through it. So I'll start off with the floor, which is the next project. So the floor is a little bit tricky in the sense that obviously it needs to be load bearing, and the other thing that makes the floor tricky is we have all of these ribs here in this van. So the ribs are different between different vans. This one is a little bit awkward in the sense that there's a lot of them and they pretty much extend the whole length of the van. So we have to take that into account. So realistically, I'm going to have some cross members, just like some battening, probably 1 by 1 inch, something like that, that will go across this way. And then I have to take into account the lengthways as well. And then there's also the odd spot, like on these sides here next to the door, right on the edge where the door is, there's a few raised little rib spots there, but they're not continuous. So I'm going to have to support whatever timber I put there with something underneath it, like a bit of ply that I cut just in strips to be able to take the weight in those sort of areas. So that's pretty awkward, but broadly speaking, on the floor, what I'm going to be doing here is this stuff. So here in the UK, this is made by a company called Recticel, and so it's obviously a type of foam inside here with a little bit of sort of cardboard or MDF, and then it's got this foil, and this foil is obviously waterproof as long as it doesn't have holes in it, and that foil obviously also acts as a vapor barrier. So obviously your vapor barrier is to stop the moisture from condensing on the outside sheet on your sort of shell. So the floor, I'm going to be putting this stuff. So this is actually 50mm board, which I bought recently, and I've made the decision that I'm actually going to swap it out for 25mm, just because of the height that I have in this van. When I was starting to look at it, and I was actually just going to be getting after it today, putting the floor down, I was looking at it and thinking, man, if I put 50mm floor with 12mm ply, I'm going to have very little headroom. I'm basically going to have, once I put the ceiling into this van, I'm going to have like 180 centimeters of height between the two, which is pretty small. I mean, I would fit in that fine, but anyone slightly taller than me is going to have some trouble with that. So I made the decision I'm going to take this back and see if I can swap it out for some 25mm. So 25 would be adequate. Obviously 50 mil is better because more insulation, the more it will retain heat, and the more it will keep out heat in the summer, that sort of thing. But 25 mil will be fine. So essentially the plan is for the floor here, I'm going to go with 25 mil recticel board like this. And then I'm going to put plywood over the top of that. Because we've got these ribs, I am going to spray expanding foam underneath the recticel. So I'm essentially going to spray it, put the recticel down. That'll do two things. One, the expanding foam acts as an adhesive, so it'll help to kind of glue that foam, the boards down there, and it'll also just add an additional layer of insulation. So obviously all of the gaps between these ribs, there'll be that foam which will help with that. And then the third thing that the expanding foam does is it'll act as a vapor barrier itself, because it is waterproof, and when it sticks to the outer shell, it'll act as a vapor barrier. And then in addition to that, it'll also act as sound deadening. So you often see people sort of sticking bits of sound deadening all over the insides of their vans, depending on the insulation that they're going for. So obviously with that expanding foam on the floor here, that's going to make a big difference for that. So that's kind of the plan for the floor. The wheel wells, I'm going to box them in, then I'm just going to spray that in with expanding foam. It's going to be the easiest. Number of factors. It'll act as sound deadening when it sticks to the actual wheel well. It's very good insulation, and it'll just be the easiest in terms of just filling that whole gap with insulation. I'm going to do that on both sides, obviously. Then the walls, I'm actually going to use expanding foam for both of the walls and the ceiling. And there are a number of reasons why I've made that decision. One is the convenience. It means that I'm not cutting this border out, trying to fit it in there. It also means that I can fill the whole cavity with expanding foam, with insulation, have a really thick layer of insulation there, and not have sort of any dead spots or anything like that. And the convenience. Essentially, I'm going to be putting in sort of like a form type thing with some sort of plastic sheeting. So the plastic sheet will act as a vapor barrier, even though the expanding foam will as well. But the plastic sheet will essentially help for it not to stick on the form. So I'll put a plastic sheet up there, put a form against it and secure that, and spray the expanding foam and let it sort of expand upwards, and I'll just kind of move up until I've got this whole side done. Obviously frame out the window beforehand so that I don't get foam all over that, and we'll work around that. And then I'll essentially do the same on the ceiling, and work around like that, and just let it expand into the gaps and stuff that it needs to. Give it time for each time. I mean, it'll be a bit of a slow process. I'll kind of do that over a few days, kind of do a section, let that dry out, move the form up, do another section, that sort of thing. But that'll give us really solid, good insulation, and it'll be completely watertight. The expanding foam, as I've mentioned, will act as sound deadening. So instead of just having a couple of little strips of sound deadening here and there, which the insulation then goes against, that entire wall will be completely sound deadened, because the foam will stick to the wall, and it's obviously providing insulation. And then I'll do the same for the ceiling as well. So put a form up, spray the foam in, and just move the form as the foam goes. And there are a number of reasons why I've opted for that option. And I mean, with all of these things, there's a level of effort to them, and it varies. And I don't think that one is easier than the other. So I don't think the expanding foam is easier than the other, but I think given the shape that you're working with and stuff, in my opinion, the expanding foam option is the best route to go with a van conversion like this. So if we talk about the sort of insulation properties, this stuff here, this recticel foam, is actually probably has the lowest R value when you look at the stats. So I think that this stuff comes out at like 2.75, an R value of like 2.75 or something like that. So it's actually pretty low R value but for what we're doing here, it's perfectly adequate. It's also probably the easiest to install on this sort of setting in the floor like that. If we look at the other options that you have available, like the rock wool or fiber wool, whatever you want to call it, I mean, there's loads of different options, and they're made of different stuff. So whether they're more natural products like sheep wool, or whether they sort of come from a fiberglass manufacturing process, which is obviously more artificial, they also, all of within that, all have varying R values. But that is a very strong insulation in terms of its performance, provided that a number of things are considered. So one is, depending on which type you go for, if it gets wet, obviously that will affect the R value, because it'll potentially it loses its loft, that sort of thing. So you have to consider your vapor barrier and stuff. So if it gets wet, you may just lose all of your R value, in which case you're pretty screwed in terms of the performance of your insulation. But I just don't like working with that stuff. It's just it's a bit of a pain to have to hang and work in these gaps and stuff like that, and especially when you get to the ceiling, having to try and, I don't know how, I've seen various ways of doing it. So people do like put string across and then hang it, and then put their ceiling and that sort of thing. I'm not a huge fan of working with that stuff, and I think the expanding foam option is a better route as far as just the ease of install. So if we talk about the R value of the expanding foam, that's actually probably, depending on which brand of expanding foam you buy, it has some of the better R values and insulation properties. So they start at sort of the rock wool or that fiber wool, generally speaking, they're probably at like 3.5 to 4 R value. And then the expanding foam, generally that's kind of where they start. If you get kind of a lower quality one, if you go up and get sort of really high quality expanding closed cell foam, some of them are performing all the way up to like 8 or 9 R value. So they're very high performing from that point of view. Now, the expanding foam is not all singing and dancing. There are some concerns around that. So some people don't like it because of the potential chemicals that they emit, that sort of thing. I've used it extensively in a lot of different projects and a lot of applications, even through to sort of stuff in houses, all that sort of stuff. And I just don't think that, I think if you apply it well and you give it time to set, I think that it's fine. I don't know anyone personally that has had a problem with any of sort of the chemicals not setting properly and then making them sick or anything like that. And I'm comfortable in the approach that I'm going to take with installing it in this van, that will not be a problem. We're going to give it enough time to dry out. We're going to give it enough space to expand properly. We'll obviously also use the stuff properly in terms of shaking the cans well to mix the contents and get everything ready to go. And then when we actually spray it in, we'll give it time to mix up and expand and do what it needs to do. So yeah. That's kind of the plan for the installation here. So recticel board on the floor with expanding foam, and then expanding foam on the walls and on the ceiling. And I'll obviously document those processes as well. So the walls and the ceiling are going to be slightly slower because I'm going to have to move forms up as I spray it and as it dries out. I'm obviously going to have to frame out the windows before I do that, so that I spray kind of up to those frames, that sort of thing. And then also these there's going to be a section on the door, on these walls here next to the bed, where I'll probably just use the recticel, the thinner one, the 25mm recticel, because I'm going to be framing it out in a way that I can maximize the length, because the bed's going to be this way, so we're going to sleep that way. So I'm going to want to have as much length as possible, so pretty much have probably 25mm of insulation there. I'll just put this stuff on, and I'll probably just Sikaflex or glue it onto the walls, obviously then with something to actually hold it in place, but something along those lines. So yeah, that's kind of the plan and my thought process and thinking behind the installation for this van. So hopefully that's been helpful for you, giving you some info that maybe you didn't know before. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, I'd love you to drop them in the comments down below. But yeah, otherwise I hope you are enjoying following this series and getting something out of it. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.